We have
The
finally
Dreshkan
reached the
Convergence's
stars.
intelligence division
Our
had
journey.
been studying humanity for 103 years before anyone inside the division admitted that the study had produced a conclusion they did not know what to do with. The admission came from a senior analyst named Dreshkan, who had spent 31 years in the division and who had inherited the humanity file from a predecessor who had spent 22 years on it and who had inherited it from a predecessor before that. The file had been accumulating for 103 years. It filled, in the division's data architecture, a volume that exceeded the files on any other single subject the division tracked. It was the most studied subject in the Convergence's intelligence history. Dreshkan submitted the admission in the form of an internal analytical report, which was the correct procedural mechanism, titled Assessment Review, Exploitation Vectors for Human Civilization Century Review. The title was standard. The content was not. The report began. This review was commissioned to synthesize 103 years of analytical work on human civilization's structural vulnerabilities with the purpose of identifying reliable exploitation vectors for use in convergence diplomatic and military strategy. The synthesis is complete. The finding is as follows. No reliable exploitation vector has been identified. The report continued for 47 pages. Dreshkan was a methodical analyst and had documented the finding as thoroughly as the finding required, which was thoroughly, because a negative finding of this scope and duration required more documentation than a positive one, not less. The 47 pages were organized into 7 sections, each addressing a category of vulnerability that the division had been investigating across the 103 years. Each section concluded the same way. The vulnerability existed in theory, had been observed in partial or temporary forms, and had proven not to be reliably exploitable in practice. The first section was titled Biological Vulnerability. It documented everything the Convergence's biological research teams had learned about human physiology over a century of observation. The species' relatively short lifespan, its dependence on a narrow range of atmospheric and temperature conditions, its susceptibility to a range of pathogens and physical stresses that many other species' biologies were more resistant to. The section documented 7 specific biological pressure campaigns that had been modeled over the century, ranging from atmospheric contamination to targeted pathogen introduction to environmental degradation of key habitat zones. The conclusion of the section read, all 7 modeled biological pressure campaigns produced initial projections of significant human behavioral modification within 3 to 7 years. In all 7 cases, longitudinal follow-up analysis, conducted on historical data from human civilization's own experience with analogous pressures, produced a different finding. Human civilization has experienced 14 events in its recorded history classifiable as civilization-threatening biological, environmental, or physical stresses. In each of the 14 cases, the civilization's response included development of countermeasures, institutional adaptation, behavioral modification that increased rather than decreased long-term resilience, and subsequent capability enhancement that exceeded pre-event levels. The biological vulnerability is real. The exploitation vector is not. The stress produces adaptation, not collapse. The second section was titled Social Fragmentation. It documented a century of analysis of humanity's internal divisions: political, cultural, linguistic, economic, ideological. The full spectrum of the kinds of divisions that the Convergence's strategic models had consistently identified as the most reliable exploitation vectors in any civilization. The section was the longest in the report, at 14 pages, because humanity's internal divisions were extensive and well documented, and the division had spent more analytical hours on this category than any other. The conclusion of the second section read, human internal divisions are real, significant, and persistent. The civilization has not achieved and does not appear to be approaching the kind of unified governance that would eliminate these divisions. In 103 years of analysis, 17 distinct fragmentation scenarios were modeled. In each scenario, the projected outcome was internal conflict severe enough to reduce humanity's external strategic capability for a period of 5 to 30 years. Longitudinal follow-up analysis produced the following finding. Human history contains 43 recorded instances of internal division reaching the severity threshold modeled in the 17 scenarios. In each of the 43 historical instances, the outcome was not the projected reduction in external strategic capability. The outcome was, in 29 of the 43 cases, increased external strategic capability following the internal conflict's resolution, driven by the specific adaptations the conflict had produced. In 11 cases, the external strategic capability remained stable. In 3 cases, it declined temporarily and recovered within a decade. The more significant finding is this. In each of the 43 historical instances, external pressure applied during the period of internal division produced a temporary suspension of the division and a consolidated response to the external pressure. In 26 of the 43 cases, the consolidated response to external pressure was more capable than the divided response would have been, because the external pressure had provided a unifying focus that the internal division had been preventing. The fragmentation scenario does not produce a weakened humanity. In the presence of external pressure, it produces a consolidated one. The third section was economic disruption. It documented modeling of trade embargo, resource denial, supply chain interdiction, and currency destabilization scenarios. The conclusion noted that human economic systems had historically demonstrated recovery rates from major disruption that exceeded the Convergence's own economic recovery benchmarks by a factor of between 1.4 and 2.1, and that the recovery mechanism invariably included the development of alternative supply chains and economic structures that left the post-recovery civilization less dependent on the disrupted resources than the pre-disruption one had been. The conclusion noted that economic disruption applied to humanity produced, with reliable consistency, economic diversification that made the same disruption less effective if applied again. The fourth section was leadership elimination. It documented analysis of the effect on human civilization of removing key decision-makers, of political leaders, military commanders, scientific figures, diplomatic specialists. This section was, Dreshkan noted, the most technically sophisticated category of exploitation vector in the division's analytical history, and the section had been compiled by a dedicated team over 40 years. The conclusion read, human institutions are designed with explicit redundancy in leadership functions. The UEDF has documented succession protocols extending 7 layers deep for every command position. The compact diplomatic corps maintains shadow delegation structures. The scientific and technical communities operate through distributed knowledge frameworks that do not have single points of failure. This is not a recent development. Human governance documentation from 200 years ago contains explicit language about the importance of institutional continuity independent of individual leadership. The civilization has been building redundancy into its leadership structures since before it achieved interstellar capability. The elimination of any individual or any group of individuals produces succession, not collapse. The fifth section was temporal exploitation, the use of humanity's relatively short individual lifespan and generational turnover as an exploitation vector. The theory being that a civilization with 60 to 80-year individual lifespans would lose institutional knowledge over time and would be vulnerable to strategies that operated on longer timescales than human individuals could personally track. This section was notable for what it found. The conclusion read, the temporal exploitation vector appeared the most promising of the 7 categories in early analysis and has proven the least applicable in practice. Human civilization compensates for individual short lifespans through several mechanisms that have compounded over the period of our observation. Written and digital record-keeping of extraordinary granularity, deliberate institutional memory programs. A cultural practice of transmitting strategic and historical knowledge across generations through narrative. And most significantly, a multi-generational approach to long-term projects that treats individual mortality as a logistical variable rather than a strategic constraint. Case study: the UEDF pelagic fleet was conceived, planned, and built by individuals who did not live to see its full operational deployment. The ascending relay chain was designed by individuals who will not live to see the colonies it serves reach their second century. The compact diplomatic frameworks that currently govern humanity's interstellar relationships were built by individuals whose successors have extended them, who were trained by individuals who built the foundations, who were trained by individuals who identified the need. The temporal exploitation vector requires an opponent who loses knowledge and capability at generational turnover. Humanity does not lose knowledge at generational turnover, it accumulates it. Each generation begins with the full institutional knowledge of the previous generation and adds to it. The lifespan limitation produces urgency, not vulnerability. They build things they will not see completed because they expect their successors to complete them. This expectation has been correct in every case we have studied. The sixth section was psychological exploitation, fear, grief, despair, the range of emotional responses that the Convergence's psychological analysis teams had identified as potential leverage points in human decision-making. The conclusion was the shortest in the report. It read, "Human psychological responses to extreme stress do not follow the suppression model our doctrine assumes." The available evidence suggests that human psychological responses to extreme stress follow an activation model. The stress activates capabilities and commitments that are not present at baseline. The specific psychological response to existential threat appears to be increased rather than decreased determination, increased rather than decreased creativity, and increased rather than decreased willingness to accept personal cost in service of collective survival. We have modeled this response against the doctrine's suppression assumptions 41 times over the period of analysis. The model has not produced a reliable exploitation pathway in any of the 41 iterations. The seventh and final section was the one that Dreshkan had found hardest to write, and that was titled, in the specific language of the division's analytical framework, Unknown Vectors. It was the section for things that the analysis had found but could not categorize: the residual, the unexplained, the data that did not fit the models. It read, after 103 years of analysis across 6 identified vulnerability categories, the residual finding is as follows. Every model we have developed for predicting human behavior under pressure has underperformed. The underperformance is systematic and consistent. Humanity consistently performs above the model's upper confidence bound. This is not a modeling error in the conventional sense. The inputs are accurate, the methodology is sound, the historical data is complete. The underperformance is a feature of the subject being modeled. We have identified what we believe is the mechanism. Human civilization does not optimize for current capability. It optimizes for future capability. Every resource allocation decision we have analyzed, every strategic choice, every institutional design, every training program, they are calibrated not to maximize what humanity can do now, but to maximize what humanity can do in 10, 20, 50 years. The current capability is always the floor. The ceiling is always higher than the current capability. And the ceiling rises faster than our models project because the optimization for future capability compounds. Each generation's investments in future capability build on the previous generations, and the compounding effect produces capability growth that our linear models do not capture. The practical implication for exploitation vector analysis: there is no static vulnerability. Every vulnerability we identify is a current state vulnerability. By the time an exploitation strategy based on that vulnerability could be operationalized, the vulnerability has been addressed, and the addressing of it has left humanity more capable than it was before we identified the vulnerability. We are not studying a fixed target. We are studying a moving target that moves in the direction of our study. The more thoroughly we analyze humanity's vulnerabilities, the more thoroughly humanity, which has access to its own vulnerabilities through its own self-analysis, addresses them. We cannot find a weakness that will remain a weakness long enough to exploit. This is the finding. Dreshkan submitted the report. The Intelligence Division's review board read it. The review board's response took 11 days, which was long for a review, and the response was a request for clarification on the methodology of the 7th section, which Dreshkan provided in a 12-page supplement. And then the review board was quiet for another 6 days before the division director called Dreshkan into a meeting. The division director was a being named Dreshkan who had been running the intelligence division for 20 years, and who had in 20 years received many analytical reports, and had developed the specific quality of a senior administrator encountering findings that complicated the institutional framework that had produced them. Dreshkan said, "The report's conclusion is that we have been studying the wrong question." The report's conclusion is that the question we have been studying does not have the answer we were looking for, Dreshkan said. That is not T. He's same as the wrong question. The difference, Dreshkan said. The question, what are humanity's vulnerabilities, has a correct answer, Dreshkan said. The answer is that humanity has many vulnerabilities and they are well documented in the report. The additional finding is that the vulnerabilities are not stable exploitation vectors. That finding does not invalidate the question. It expands what we need to understand about the answer. A pause. The division has been studying humanity for 103 years with the goal of identifying how to defeat or constrain them. The report's finding suggests that goal is not achievable through the methods we have been using. The conclusion I draw is not that we have wasted 103 years. The conclusion I draw is that 103 years of data is the most complete picture of human civilization that any species outside the compact has, and that the picture is more useful for understanding what kind of relationship with humanity is viable than for understanding how to defeat them. Dreshkan was quiet. A relationship, Dreshkan said. The Convergence had a conversation with humanity 8 months ago, Dreshkan said. After the Sol encounter, the conversation produced a working document. The working document has been the basis of 4 subsequent diplomatic exchanges. Those exchanges have been productive in ways that our pre-encounter models did not project. A pause. The pre-encounter models assumed a species with identifiable vulnerabilities that would constrain their negotiating position. The encounter revealed a species with no exploitable vulnerabilities and a pelagic fleet already inside our formation. The conversation that followed was between parties on roughly equivalent terms. The outcome was better than our pre-encounter projections for any scenario based on exploitation. You are recommending we stop looking for vulnerabilities, Dreshkan said. I am recommending we accept the finding of 103 years of analysis, Dreshkan said, which is that the exploitation model does not work for this subject. I am recommending we direct the resources currently allocated to vulnerability analysis toward relationship analysis, toward understanding what humanity values, how it makes decisions, what it is building, where the ascending corridor is going, what the compact's evolving architecture looks like with humanity as an increasingly significant participant. A pause. 103 years of data. The most complete external picture of human civilization that exists. If we stop trying to use it for exploitation and start trying to use it for understanding, we have a significant institutional advantage in any relationship framework. Dreshkan looked at the 47-page report on the display between them. The report will be classified, Dreshkan said, highest level. Of course, Dreshvelkan said. Not because the finding is wrong, Dreshkan said. Because the finding, if it became known to the species being analyzed, would. They already know, Dreshvelkan said. Dreshkan looked at them. They have been doing their own self-analysis for longer than we have been doing ours, Dreshvelkan said. Their intelligence services have been aware of the Convergence's study program for at least 40 years. There is evidence in our own intercepts that they detected the third-party research network we use for indirect observation in the ascending corridor. They know we have been studying them. They know what we have been looking for. A pause. And they have spent 40 years knowing we were looking for their vulnerabilities, and using that knowledge the way they use all adverse information, as a prompt to address the vulnerabilities before anyone can exploit them. The report's finding that humanity's vulnerabilities are not stable because they address them faster than we can exploit them is partly a finding about humanity and partly a finding about what 40 years of being studied has produced in them. The room was quiet. They used our study as a diagnostic tool, Dreshkan said. They used the existence of our study as confirmation that the vulnerabilities we were likely to study were worth addressing, Dreshvelkan said. We did not identify their weaknesses and then try to exploit them. We identified their weaknesses and they identified that we had identified them and they fixed them. We have been, for 40 years, contributing to their capability development without intending to. The room was very quiet. The temporal section of the report, Dreshvelkan said, the finding that they accumulate institutional knowledge rather than losing it at generational turnover. I want to note something I did not include in the report because it was speculative, but that I believe is relevant in this context. A pause. We have been studying humanity for 103 years. We have 17 analysts who have spent their careers on this file. The institutional knowledge in this division about humanity is the most complete external knowledge that exists. That knowledge was built for exploitation. It cannot be used for exploitation, but it is still knowledge, and knowledge of this scope and duration about a species that is going to be increasingly significant in this region of space is not nothing. A pause. The report recommends redirecting toward relationship analysis. I want to note that the relationship analysis already has 103 years of foundation. We know more about humanity than humanity knows we know. That is an asset if we choose to use it differently than we intended. Dreshkan was quiet for a long time. A relationship, Dreshkan said again, with a species that has no exploitable vulnerabilities. With a species that treats adversity as information, Dreshvelkan said, that treats limitations as questions about geometry, that has survived 14 civilization-threatening events and emerged more capable from each of them, that builds things it will not see completed because it expects its successors to complete them. A pause. There is a warning archive in the Ascending Corridor, recently translated, that describes this species as the most dangerous in the region and notes that no response has been found that is both effective and advisable. The archive civilization has been watching for 8 million years. We have been watching for 103. Both of us have reached approximately the same conclusion. Another pause. The archive civilization left the archive on humanity's path. I believe the intent was communication. I believe the intent was, we see what you are, we want to know what you become, we have been watching. And what do we do, Dreshkan said, with the same conclusion. Dreshvelkan said, we do what the archive civilization did. We stop trying to constrain what we cannot constrain. We pay attention to what it becomes. And we make sure we are in a position to be part of what it becomes, rather than in a position to be left behind by it. The room held this for a moment. Dreshkan said, prepare a second report, not classified, formatted for the Convergence's Diplomatic Division and the Strategic Planning Council, the finding of the Century Review and the recommendation, a pause, and the section about what we know about them, all of it. If we are going to redirect toward relationship analysis, the diplomatic division needs to know what 103 years of data actually says. I will prepare it, Dreshkan said. How long? 2 months, Dreshkan said, maybe less. I have been thinking about how to write it for 6 years. Dreshkan said, 6 years. I began to suspect the conclusion 6 years ago, Dreshkan said. I spent 6 years completing the analysis to be certain before I wrote it down. I wanted the finding to be accurate before I submitted it. A finding of this scope that was wrong would have been worse than no finding. Dreshkan looked at them with the expression of a senior administrator, encountering a subordinate they had underestimated. You spent 6 years making certain, Dreshkan said. Accurate findings require the time they require, Dreshkan said. This one required 6 years. The meeting ended. Dreshkan returned to their office and began the second report. They began it the way they began all reports, with the findings stated clearly at the top, before the documentation, before the analysis, before the methodology, because the finding was what the report was for and burying it in the back was the practice of analysts who were not confident in their findings. And Dreshkan was confident in this one. The second report began. 103 years of analysis has produced the most complete external understanding of human civilization currently held by any non-compact species. This understanding was developed for the purpose of identifying exploitation vectors. No reliable exploitation vector was found. This report presents the finding and its implication that the knowledge developed for exploitation is best directed toward relationship, and that a relationship with human civilization entered from a position of informed understanding is among the highest value strategic options currently available to the Convergence. What follows is what we know. The report was 211 pages long. It covered everything: the pelagic fleet and its history and its current operational status, and what it meant that a species had spent 11 years building a hidden fleet specifically for its home system, and had never once disclosed it in any formal communication, because no formal communication had asked the right question. And the ascending relay chain and its purpose and the colonies it served, and the child who had been born in transit and had stood on a new world under a different sky, and what that meant for the long-term trajectory of a species moving above the galactic plane. The compact diplomatic architecture and humanity's increasingly sophisticated participation in it, the paper notebooks and the hidden joints in governance structures, the 40 minutes and the 26 years. The symposium and its findings and Navarro's addendum and the specific words. We do not fight as if we have nothing to lose. We fight as if what we have is worth the cost of keeping it. The warning archive and its description. It does not know what it is yet. When it knows what it is, the region will change. The Sol encounter and the working document and the 4-hour conversation and the line in the formal record that said, Captain Okonkwo noted the following to the bridge crew. Good. Now we have them surrounded. All of it, everything's. And at the end, a section that Dreshkan had been writing in their head for 6 years, since they began to suspect the finding, since the shape of it had begun to become clear through the data. The section was titled What They Are. It read, They are not the species we modeled. The species we modeled was a set of vulnerabilities in a biological substrate, a set of exploitable divisions in a social structure, a set of leverage points in a psychological architecture. That species does not exist. That was the model, not the subject. The subject is a species that has been building things for as long as it has been a species, and that has built, over the course of that building, something that we do not have a word for in the Convergence's analytical lexicon. The closest approximation in our vocabulary is a term used in structural engineering: load distribution, the property of a system that spreads stress across its full architecture rather than concentrating it at any single point, such that no single point of failure can collapse the whole. Human civilization distributes its load. Every vulnerability is distributed. Every capability is distributed. Every critical function has redundancy. Every critical knowledge has succession. Every critical institution has a structure that survives the loss of any individual within it. The civilization is not any of its parts. It is the architecture that holds the parts together, and the architecture has been specifically designed over centuries, through explicit choices by beings who understood what they were doing to survive the failure of any component. You cannot defeat a system designed this way by attacking its components. You can only engage with the architecture. And the architecture, when engaged with honestly and with full information, produces the kind of response we saw in the Saul encounter. A working document, a continuing conversation, a relationship that builds on accurate understanding rather than strategic advantage. We looked for a weakness for 103 years. We found none. This is not because humanity has no weaknesses. It is because humanity's weaknesses are held within an architecture designed to make them irrelevant to the civilization's survival and development. The question is not whether they have weaknesses. The question is what kind of civilization uses its weaknesses as the prompts for building something stronger. We know the answer. We have been watching for 103 years. The answer is the one we did not expect when we began. They do. Dreshkan completed the report in 7 weeks, which was 5 weeks less than they had estimated. They submitted it to Dreshkan with a note that said, "The finding took 103 years. The writing took 7 weeks. I believe the proportions are correct." The report was distributed to the Convergence's Diplomatic Division and the Strategic Planning Council. It was read carefully over a period of 3 months by beings who had spent their careers working from the assumption that exploitation was the primary instrument of interspecies strategy and who were encountering, for the first time, a comprehensive argument that the assumption was not applicable to the subject at hand. The response from the Strategic Planning Council took 2 months to produce and was a document that did not fully agree with Dreshkan's conclusions and did not fully disagree with them, and that contained, in its final section, a recommendation that a senior diplomatic team be tasked to the ongoing Convergence Humanity Framework with a mandate that was different from any previous Convergence diplomatic mandate. Not to identify leverage, not to build toward favorable terms, but to understand. The mandate used a phrase that Dreshkan had used in the second report, borrowed from the Warning Archives translation, borrowed from a civilization 8 million years ago. LD that had reached the same conclusion through 8 million years of watching. We would like to know what they becomes. The diplomatic team was assembled, the mandate was issued, the work began. On the same day in Nairobi, in the apartment that smelled of tea, Yusuf Adami, 90 years old now, still sharp, still the person who answered in 4 seconds, received a communication through the Bureau of Interstellar Communications secure channel from an address that resolved, when his granddaughter Yemi traced it, to a Convergence diplomatic relay in the ascending corridor. The communication said, "Dr. Adami, we have read your transmission to the Rethvar. We have read 103 years of analysis about the species you represent. We have a question that we have been building toward for a long time, and we believe you are the person to receive it. The question is the same one the archive asked. We ask it now directly without the distance of a signal planted on a path. What do you become? We are asking because we want to know, not because we need to know for strategic purposes. Because we have been watching for 103 years and the watching has produced something we did not expect, genuine curiosity. We are afraid and we are curious, and both of these have been true for a long time. We stayed to see what happens next. We would like to ask you to tell us." Yusuf read the communication twice. He picked up his pen. He opened the notebook on his desk, not the old one from the Rethvar transmission, that one was in a museum, but the current one, the one he still filled because the habit was older than he was and would outlast him. He wrote not the response but the notes toward it, because the response required the kind of accuracy that notes produced. He wrote they watched for 103 years and found no weakness. They found what everyone finds who watches long enough, what we actually are, which is different from what they were looking for. He wrote the question is what we become. The honest answer is still, we do not know yet. We are still building the answer. He wrote, but we can tell them what we have learned about the direction. The direction is enough to say something true about. He set down the pen. He looked at the notebook. Outside the window of the apartment, Nairobi was going about the ordinary business of a Thursday morning, the sounds of a city that had survived everything a city could survive and was still, after all of it, a city, going about its business, building the next thing. He thought about 41 days. He thought about the transmission he had written and what had come back from it. He thought about his granddaughter Yemi in the ascending corridor with an archive 8 million years old and a question about what humanity was going to do about itself. He thought we have been asked this question twice now, by different beings from different distances with different histories. Both of them watched for a long time and found the same thing and asked the same question. We answer it the same way both times. We answer it honestly, which means incompletely, which means we say, we are still becoming. The becoming is what we can offer. The direction of the becoming is what we can describe. The full answer will come from the people who come after us, who will build on what we built the way we built on what came before us. Well, he picked up the pen again. He wrote the first line of the response. He wrote, you have watched for 103 years and found no weakness. This does not surprise me. We have been watching ourselves for much longer and we have found the same thing, not an absence of weakness, but an architecture that makes weakness into prompt. What you call strength is mostly just what happens when a species decides that every difficulty is a question about how to be better next time. Well, he kept writing. It took him 3 days. He was 90 years old and he wrote more slowly now than he had at 58, but the slowness was not imprecision. It was care. The care that came from knowing that some things needed to be exactly right because they were the things that would carry the most weight. On the third day, he read the full response back to himself. He made 2 changes, small ones in the second paragraph and the fifth. Then he read it again. He thought, yes, that is the truest thing I can find. That is what I can say about the direction. Well, he sent it. He closed the notebook. Well, he made tea. He sat by the window and watched Nairobi in the morning light, which was the same light that had fallen on this city every morning for longer than any building in it could remember, which was the same light that would fall on it long after everyone currently in it was gone, which was the same light that was falling, right now, on relay stations and colony ships and a pelagic fleet in the deep field and a child who had been born in transit and a merchant running agricultural substrate to a third-year colony that needed to know the goods would keep coming. He thought this is what we are, this is the direction. He thought the answer is still being written. He was glad he had lived long enough to contribute a line.